والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله. We begin in the name of Allah Azza wa Jal by asking Him to send peace and blessings upon our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. May His peace and blessings be upon him and his family. I'd like to welcome everyone to the second class for our history of Islam and world history. This is the legacy of Islam. I'm very excited, mashallah, to be here, and we're going to be discussing some pretty cool topics today. So, just by way of logistics, I realized last week went a little long. So inshallah what we'll do is we'll probably, the next 45, 50 minutes, we'll have a bit of a lecture, and then we'll break for about 10, 15 minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll continue with the second part of the talk. My goal is to try and get everybody out of here before 4 o'clock, inshallah. That's the goal. It's a lofty goal, but inshallah we'll be able to do it. Before I begin for today's class, are there any questions from the previous class that we discussed? I know it was rapid fire going through how we understand history and then into the Khulafa Rashidin and covering up with them, and so just wanted to see if there was anything that came out of the discussion or top of mind that people would like to ask about or discuss today. Yes, sister. There is a Zoom link. I started the Zoom. I don't know where to link it to. That's part of the problem. There was supposed to be a WhatsApp group that was started, but I haven't seen one get started by the I am recording it, so after the class I can send a recording, inshallah. And I believe Adam's Ashburn is actually live streaming. I don't know if anybody wants to kind of film that on their phone and see if it's maybe on Adam's Ashburn YouTube. But the first class was recorded apparently on Adam's Ashburn YouTube. I can send you a link if you have the email, then I can send it to you, inshallah. Anybody else? We're going to try to work that out. So as just by way of logistics, next week, inshallah, I'm not here. We are traveling next week. The following week will have to be on Zoom. So for that, I will have the Zoom link sent out. I'm live? Okay. Can you share that link then with the, that's good to know that I'm live. It looks like it is being recorded on Adam's Ashburn. Yeah, I don't know who, I guess it's Adam, is it on YouTube? It's just Adam Ashburn YouTube. And it's there? Yeah, it's going live. Yeah, so once it goes live, YouTube stores it. So. The one thing is, I don't know, I'm not as familiar, if this class overrides the last one. Oh, last week's class is there? Okay, well, mashallah, she's got us covered. Last week's class and this week's class. Okay, any other questions, comments, criticisms, side remarks? No, inshallah we'll keep those. I'm going to try to stay seated this week because I know there was a lot of microphone issues that we had last week. Hopefully that will prevent that. I like to get up and walk around, so I apologize in advance if that's the case. Okay, Bismillah. Who remembers what we covered last time? How far did we get? Yes. That's the way it's doing. The Khulafa Rashidun. Good, okay. So we covered the Khulafa Rashidun, in particular the first 4 Khalifas, right? Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali ibn Abi Talib. Now, as we recall, I didn't give you all the details, but really, civilizationally, what we have to thank them for, essentially, what they did for the Islamic civilization. Today, we're actually, the first part of the class, so the first, 30, 45 minutes or so, is going to be talking about something that was developed during their time that many of us don't think about being developed during their time. Right? So in those first 50 years or so, what was happening with the general populace of the Muslims that were especially in Medina, but as they spread out. So today, inshallah, we're going to talk about, it's going to last very long. Okay, so what we're going to talk about, inshallah, is the development of Islamic law during the time of the early caliphate. The Islamic law during the time of the early caliphate. Okay, This is very important because what happens here sets the tone for all of us today in this masjid. We take our law from what was formatively developed there. So as a civilization, what we did. So let's just get right into it, inshallah. There are a couple of different things that we need to discuss when it comes to Islamic law, right? When the Prophet ﷺ was alive, there was no question about who owns, quote unquote, the law. Whatever the Prophet said was done, and the people understood that this is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Sahaba that lived through him, or in his time, they understood that too. With the Prophet, what he says is law, and therefore we will follow him. The people after the Prophet now had to negotiate what actually was from Allah and what was otherwise just a normative practice of the people of Arabia. Everybody follow me? You guys know what I mean by normative? That's what they would regularly do. For instance, is it the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ to wear a turban? This is one of the discussions, right? Because the scholars had to determine, is a turban a head covering that is religiously mandated, or is a turban something that is culturally mandated? You guys follow what I mean by that? It's very important for future generations to know, like, hey, do we have to walk around with a turban on our heads, right? Or is it okay to simply have my head covered, or to maybe even not have my head covered, right? These are some of the things that the scholars would have to talk about. At the time of the Prophet ﷺ, everybody wore a turban. That's what the scholars determined. So therefore, it's okay to wear a turban, but if you don't wear a turban, mafi mushkila, right? It's not a problem, essentially. So I'm just giving you kind of an example. Islamic law has different dimensions. Number one, and by the way, I realize that for those that have done the certification program, you already had a class on this. So I'm not going to bore you with the details. This is going to be just for those of us maybe that aren't as familiar with the development of Islamic law. This was happening on the ground with the tabi'een and the tabi'een and the sahaba, and I think it's important for us to just recognize it, okay? So, number one, the study of aqeedah. Aqeedah literally translates into that which you hold fast to. Aqad is something that you hold fast to. Aqeedah, from our standpoint, means that what is the system of belief that we hold fast to, right? In later generations, this would become ilm al-tawheed or ilm al-kalam, right? But there was a whole science that was developed around what our belief system is, right? We believe in Allah as one. We believe in the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ as the final messenger, and we believe in Yawm al-Qiyamah. Right? Those are parts of our belief system. That's aqeedah. Also, what was developed was fiqh. Fiqh is a juristic or legal understanding of how the law of God should be applied in a particular context. So in Medina, law was one thing. If you went to Iraq, that same law may be applied differently. Or if you went to Spain, as we'll see, it might be applied differently. That's what fiqh is, understanding how that law should be applied. Sharia, on the other hand, is the law of God as it is. That's the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's what Sharia is. Right? And again, I'm not going into the linguistic definition and all of that. But for us practically speaking, for Muslims, Sharia is the law of God as it is. Now, it could be applied in a different way depending on our circumstances. Right? So depending on our circumstances, it could be applied a certain way. That's fiqh. That's what the faqih or the scholar is supposed to understand. Later on, you would have the idea of the madhabs, a juristic school of Islamic law. I was trying to think of an American equivalent to this. And I'm not sure I've really found one. The closest I could maybe see is, how many people have studied American history? Okay, so in the early days of the government being established, anyone know who the two main factions were when the government was being established? The Federalists, right? There were two strains within the Federalists that was basically a difference of opinion. Anyone know what that was? Even to this day, it's amazing how far back these issues go. You had basically on one side Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson believed very wholeheartedly in a, let's just say, not so strong federal government and a very strong state government. On the other side, you had Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton believed very firmly in a strong federal government. Right now. The others were, yes, exactly. Hamilton was a Federalist, and the others were Democratic Republican, and then eventually that got split into what we call the Democrats and the Republicans. Right? Now, the reason I share that with you is because they were looking at the same law. They're looking at the same Constitution, but they're interpreting it in different ways. One is saying, no, this Constitution is meant to be more towards states' rights. Another one is saying, no, it should be more towards the federal rights. They're looking at the same law, right? Everybody follow me? In the terms of the madhabs, this was very similar. We understood Sharia as being the law of God as it is. Different scholars would say, this is how we understand that law of Allah to be applied, right? All of them, by the way, go back to Quran and Sunnah. So there's no difference of opinion on that. Right? And then finally, and we'll discuss this at the very end of the first part of the class, what are the maqasid of Sharia? Very important, especially for today's conversations that we have with Islam in the West, right? So we'll cover some of these. Now, historical development, I shared this map last time. Islam started in Jazirat al-Arab, in the Arabian Peninsula. Within the first, really 50 years, but definitely in the first 100 years, it begins to spread both to the east and to the west and to the south, somewhat to the north too. Right? So in all directions, it's starting to spread. Now, what's really interesting is two things are happening here. Number one, Islam is going into new lands. But it's also, there's a time dimension. We're getting further and further away from the death of the Prophet ﷺ. Further being like, not physically, but there's more time that's passing. So you have the passage of time and you have the passage of space. It's what we call the time-space kind of dilemma here. So Islam spreads in time and space to different places of the world, and every set of believers that come next have to negotiate what is part of our belief system and how do we apply law. So Islamic law, what I'm trying to say here is it develops with these different forces in mind. Very important for us today to understand that. It's not like people just said, oh, okay, this was how it was in Medina, therefore it's going to be applied everywhere else. With certain things you can do that, like salah. You can go to any masjid in any part of the world and the qibla is one direction. You're not going to go into a masjid and say, hey, you know what? The qibla should actually be pointing the other way. There are some people that have tried that, by the way. Right? People they're not going to follow that. So there are certain things, no matter what masjid you walk into, you know, there's probably going to be rows and there's probably going to be a qibla in the direction of the mihrab. Right? Those are kind of non-negotiables for them. What's very interesting, and I mentioned this book last time, Richard Bullitt, has a book called The Conversion to Islam in the Medieval Period. And he argues that Islam takes approximately 225 years in the new areas that it conquers before that land becomes 50% Muslim. You guys know what I mean by that, right? I shared this example last time. Islam gets here to Fustat, or to Cairo, relatively early, in the time of Amr ibn al-As. Right? So this is just 20, 30 years after the Prophet ﷺ. However, at that moment, in Cairo and in Fustat, that land is largely non-Muslim. The vast majority of that land will stay non-Muslim for 2.5 centuries. Okay? So you have Muslims in charge, but the people that they're ruling are not Muslims. Really important for us to understand that. We sometimes think that everywhere Muslim Islam went, that all of a sudden it became like Saudi or like Arabia, like Medina and Mecca. Everybody's in a majority Muslim context. That's not the case at all. Fiqh has to take into consideration this Islamic law takes into consideration that, hey, guys, not everybody under us is going to be Muslim. Therefore, how do we live in a society where people are Muslims and they're non-Muslims? Now, this is actually a very important concept for us. And I think I mentioned last time, Dr. Sahel Hanif has a beautiful talk on this, the idea of establishing Medina wherever we go and wherever we spread to, and Muslims tended to do this. And he talks about this idea of what attracted people to Islam was that after about 200 years, you had these thriving Muslim civilizations in these different areas. And people just wanted to be a part of it. I wanted to read you guys actually a passage. Brother Saladin, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward him. He got me this new book. I got really excited when I was reading it. This is a book by Marmaduke Pickthall. You guys know that name? Muhammad Marmaduke Pickthall was one of the, he might actually be, he's the first English-speaking translator of the Quran, English native-speaking translator of the Quran from the 1930s. His publication, The Meanings of the Glorious Quran, was the first time that the Quran had been rendered into English language in history, right, from Arabic. Well, by a British, I mean, he was British. What was really interesting was, I read in the beginning of this book, so this book actually is called The Early Hours. It's one of his novels. He was actually a very famous best-selling novelist before he became Muslim and then translated the Quran later on. But he traveled a lot in the Muslim world. He was always very religious, and he wanted to go to Jerusalem. So he goes to Palestine, he finds his way to Palestine, to Jerusalem, and at the age of like 17 or 18, he ends up being with the Muslims in Jerusalem. And I want to read to you something that he wrote. So this is what Marmaduke Pickthall writes. So this is, again, he's visiting Ottoman Jerusalem. To be clear, he's going to Ottoman Jerusalem. And he went to Damascus and he went to all around the Arab world. He's from London. This is in the late 1890s, early 1900s. He writes the following. The Orient came as a revelation, Orient being the Middle East. Later in life, he wrote the following. When I read the Arabian Nights, I see the daily life of Damascus, Jerusalem, Aleppo, Halab, Cairo, and other cities as I found it in the early 90s of the last century. So this is 1890s. What struck me, even in its decay and poverty, was the joyousness of that life compared with anything I had seen in Europe. Now, listen to the following. The people seemed quite independent of our cares of life, our anxious clutching after wealth, and our fear of death. This is Marmaduke Pickthall thinking about his time as a non-Muslim, visiting the lands of the Muslims, saying they were operating at a different level. They didn't have the same issues that we do. In Europe, he's saying that the cares of life, the anxious pursuit of wealth, the clutching of it, and our fear of death, all of this was non-existent. Why am I pointing this? That's what the civilization produced. A group of Muslims, the cities of Muslims that were joyous, that had this sense of living, but weren't bogged down necessarily with the kind of what modernity had taken upon Europe and in terms of chasing after materialism and wealth and amassing all of these things. Marmaduke Pickthall in the 1890s recognized that. There's something different here. And a lot of people would later become Muslim. It took them 2.5 centuries, but they would become Muslim simply by being a part of that civilization. You guys follow me? Now, of course, there was dawah. I'm not trying to take that away. There were people who were marrying into Muslim families, who were giving dawah. All of that was there. But you also had this civilizational aspect. So when Islamic law is developing early on, they're having to negotiate, not negotiate, but they're having to talk to people who are non-Muslim and recognize, hey, how do we administer our affairs this way, right? So keep that in mind as we talk about this. Now, the way I did this was I divided, I shouldn't say I, Dr. Suleiman Yang and others divided it into different phases. The first phase of Islamic law development happened during the time of the Khulafa Rashidin. It's called the formative phase. At this point, Islam is both religious and political. What do I mean by that? What do I mean by Islam being both religious and political? Who wants to take a stab at it? Yeah? It's the reverse. So those who were politically in charge were also religious leaders. For instance, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq was the one who was giving the khutbah on Fridays. Everybody follow me? He's the Khalifa of the Muslims and he's giving the khutbah. That doesn't happen later on. The khatibs, they will give khutbah in the name of the caliph, but they're not the caliph themselves. During this time period, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, they were seen as the de facto religious leaders. People did not argue with, oh, does he have enough knowledge or not? Right? They recognize that. And so their ijtihad, right, their reasonable opinions that they arrived at, they were seen as being a source of, these people know what's best for us based on the community. They're going to operate in the way that the Prophet ﷺ would have operated. Now, and again, I share with you a couple of examples. Abu Bakr fighting the tribes to pay zakah. We talked about this last time. He believed fundamentally zakah is an obligation that we will have to fight people for and make sure that they give it. Abu Bakr compiling the Quran into one mushaf. That process started during his lifetime. It was not done during the life, and there were people who said at this time that challenged him on that, but he's like, no, this is something that needs to be done for our future. Umar suspended corporal punishment during the drought. The very famous example of this is when there was a drought in Medina and people were stealing bread, he suspended the punishment for stealing. He said, no, that is done, that punishment is meant to ward off people when the situation is normal. A drought is not normal. People are starving and they're hungry. So if they're stealing bread, they may be punished, but we can't apply the had punishment. Right? So there's a difference. So again, he's using his intellect to make a judgment call on what the Prophet ﷺ would have done. And during the time of Imam Malik, he writes down the Muwatta, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we get there. And then each of these rightly guided khalifas that we discussed last week were seen as a scholar in and of themselves. But, however, during this time, the one thing that is collected, or starting to get collected and memorized, are the sayings of the Prophet ﷺ. So the hadith, people wanted to know, what did he say? How did he say it? What did he mean? Right? They're collecting those. And there were people, even at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, that were memorizing things that were coming out of his mind. Okay? So that is starting to happen now at this time. After the formative phase, we go into the phase of documentation. In the phase of documentation, now there's a split between the political leadership and scholarship. Okay, so you may have a khalifa, does not necessarily mean that that khalifa is the most knowledgeable person around. This basically starts with the Umayyads, by the way, that we'll cover hopefully in the second part of class today. Right, so at that point, now you have, the Umayyads and the Abbasid Khalifas, they try to dictate religious law and tell them this is what you need to do, but people don't buy it. They're like, no, that's not what our scholars have told us. Right? They're not able, so later on what we'll see is the scholarship that Islamic law developed actually was in opposition to the rulership. They would oftentimes write things and say things in direct opposition to the Khalifa or to their governors. seen as, one of my teachers once said, Sheikh Faisal Madadar, Hafidullah, he said, it was basically the pre-modern protest movement against the government. That's what the scholars were seen as, right? They were a protest movement. Now, bona fide scholars of Islamic sciences start to gain authority over the doctrines of belief. Just because the Khalifa says, hey, this is how you pray, the people don't follow the Khalifa. They're going to go to the scholar and say, how do we actually pray? Right? They're beginning to vest authority in the people of scholarship when it comes to their ibadah, when it comes to their rituals and worship. Everybody follow me so far? Right? This is important just to recognize. You and I don't take our prayers the way that we pray. We don't take that from Khalifa so-and-so. We take that directly from the scholars. And the scholars were the ones that were interpreting Islamic law and understanding, what did the Prophet mean by this? What does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intend by this? Right? They were oftentimes persecuted by the political establishment. I can tell you how many of our scholars actually died in jail. Sometimes they wrote some of their best works in jail. They were being opposed for not doing what they wanted them to do, essentially. So the idea of being kind of a politically motivated, scholarship or in jail terms, all that stuff, that goes way back. Because these people were seen as being oppositional to the government. I just have some dates here. Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, Ash-Shafi, Ahmad ibn Hanbal. They don't have none of them had political authority. These are some of the more famous names from our Islamic tradition. None of them had political authority. They were not a khalifa, they were not a governor. None of them. But what they had was religious authority with the people. People followed what they said. So one thing that we have to recognize about authority, guys. Authority can be taken by force, but it's given by the people. So in other words, you can become a new king, but that doesn't mean that people will follow you just because you're the king. Right? You can amass influence with people. That's true authority. When you're able to tell them, this is what I want you to do. You guys ever watched old school Malcolm X movie that Spike Lee made way back in like 1990s? There's one particular scene that still really rings out to me, where one of the members of the Nation of Islam, in the movie it shows that one of the members of the Nation of Islam is beat up by the police and is then hospitalized. And Malcolm X, he takes a group of his Fruit of Islam soldiers, right? And he walks with them and marches with them from the place. They wouldn't allow him to get into the ambulance, so he marches all the way to the hospital with them to make sure that his guy is going to get treated at the hospital. Now, along the way, massive amounts of people start to follow this entourage from the Nation of Islam. It's really amazing. I mean, it gives me chills now even thinking about the movie. There's this one scene where he stands in front. You stand in front of the hospital, and it's him, and there's 4 or 5 rows of the Fruit of Islam bodyguards that are all behind him. And then behind them is a huge amount of people that are just rioting. I should say they're rioting. They're yelling. They're yelling. And Malcolm X stands, and basically the policeman says to him, why are you here? He's like, we want to make sure that our guy is getting treated. He's like, as you can see, we brought him to the hospital. He's now getting the treatment. I need you to get rid of this crowd. That's what he told Malcolm X to do. So Malcolm X turns around, looks directly at the crowd, puts up his hand like this. Everybody quiets down. And then he goes and does this. And slowly, one by one, the rows of the Fruit of Islam, those soldiers, they turn and they start walking in this direction. And then he just walks with them. And the scene at the end of that is the policeman looking at what he just did with that entire crowd. He goes, that's too much power for one man to have. That's the line you're reading. That is too much power for one man to have. Why did he have that power? Because people had given that authority. The people who were there, they were following. Malcolm X was he was a minister in the Nation of Islam at best. He didn't have any political authority, but he had the people's authority. These scholars, that's what they had. They had the authority of the masses behind them. Everybody follow me on this? Documentation of Islamic law starts at this point. In fact, my not here. That was he actually wrote a paper on the critical role that Imam Abu Hanifa in particular did in terms of codifying law, right? And it's a beautiful paper. I'll see if we can set up that WhatsApp group at some point. We'll see if we can send it out, inshallah. It's a great paper to read, mashallah. But really, what he did, and then also if we can set up that WhatsApp group, I'll send out the slides so that we don't, take a picture the whole time or worried about it. Okay, real quick as we go on, we go from the documentation phase to the institutionalization phase. I know it's a big word. Big word just means that now you have scholarship that's taught in the actual madrasas, in actual schools. So by the 4th Hijri century, is around the 1000s, 1100s, you have Islamic law fully developed. Aqidah, Hadith, Ulum al-Quran, Usul al-Fiqh, Maqasid al-Sharia, all of this is now actually being taught as disciplines in these schools. And it's supported by a formal madrasa system that actually still exists to this day, right? And this produces people like Al-Ghazali, like Ibn Taymiyyah, Tajuddin al-Subki, right? Ibn Rushd, like these stalwarts in our tradition are produced out of this madrasa system. Now, there's a whole, I'm not going to get into too many details, but you have a system of how you can certify that one scholar has the ability to now teach. It was through a system known as ijazah. You had to get ijazah or permission to teach. Even to this day, my own teachers, they were given ijazah and permission by their teachers to teach the sciences or to teach certain texts. That's how they got that. And it was a very formal system that we had. Some modern day scholars would say it's the oldest kind of degree granting institutions in the world were Muslim ones, because they granted degrees, like Qarawiyyin, for instance, university in Fez, Morocco, that granted degrees to people back in like the 1,000+ years ago, right? So it's the longest degree granting institution in the world today, arguably with Al-Azhar. Now, amazingly, everything that I just told you was independent of the state. Much of those madrasas, some of them were run by the state, many of them were actually run by awqaf, by trusts that were set up by business people to actually keep the knowledge going, keep that transmission of knowledge going. So don't ever let anybody tell you that business is not important, right? People would do great things with their money, whether it was investing in madrasas or schooling, whether it was investing in maristans, which we'll talk about in future classes, and those healing centers for Muslims. These were all things that were kind of the community felt this is our obligation to invest in, and we're going to produce that, right? So this is just, again, during the phase of institutionalization. Hadith sciences in particular, I'm going to spend just a minute talking about this, because this becomes a big point of contention today. Most of the differences that people fight about, Muslims, right, come from hadith. They don't come from, very few, there are some difference of opinion about people have about certain things in the Quran, but by and large, that's not it. It's in the hadith literature, what did the Prophet ﷺ mean? One thing I just wanted to show here was that there is a difference traditionally between hadith and sunnah. Sunnah was what the Prophet's normative practice was. Hadith was seen as a means of determining the sunnah. They weren't interchangeable. Modern days, it's become a little bit more interchangeable. But traditionally, the sunnah was actually more akin to the seerah of the Prophet. They saw that as being a normative practice. This became a problem. This would develop fully later on. So you'll see here the canonization through certain scholars. Imam Malik, early on, he died in 179 after the Hijrah, right? One of the earliest people to write a book of hadith, the Muwatta and the Mudawwina, both from Imam Malik. The Imam Malik's Muwatta book, although it's not strictly about just hadith from the Prophet, it includes many hadith from the Prophet. His book actually, just for those that, if you're interested, is actually more of a book of the practice of Medina. So the logic there was that, hey, we're only 3 generations removed from the Prophet here in Medina. Whatever is the normative practices of people of Medina is probably the sunnah of the Prophet. So that was kind of the thing there. Now, you had Imam Bukhari in 256, Imam Muslim in 261, Abu Dawood in 275. This is the date of their deaths. Imam at-Tirmidhi 279, Ibn Majah 275, and An-Nisa'i 303. Those last six are known as the Sahih Sitta. They are known as the six sound books of hadith. The books that they produced are known as the six sound books of hadith, with Bukhari and Muslim being kind of the top of the echelon, if you will. Right? Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. There's a whole science that's developed in hadith studies known as ilm al-rijal, the science of people, where they would go and study. By the way, everybody know what a hadith consists of? Is this new material? Hadith consists of two parts, something called a sanad and something called a watan. No. Matan. I was like, no, watan. Matan. Matan and sanad. The hadith, if the hadith is إنما الأعمال بالنيات. That's a good one, right? It's the first one in Arba'in an-Nawawi. So that hadith, literally the matan, the text of the hadith is, intentions are, actions are by their intentions. That's the way it's oftentimes translated, right? The sanad is who are the narrators that narrated that hadith. So you have the text of the hadith, but then you also have the narrators. Oh, this is Umar ibn Khattab, this is, and whoever heard it, who heard it from Umar ibn Khattab, and who heard it from that person, who heard it from that person, that is known as the sanad. In Islamic history, you had to not just be right in the text, but also who delivered that text. That's ilm al-rijal. That's the science of people. So there are scholars who would spend their time trying to determine whether or not this person was qualified to be able to say that hadith. That's how strict this science was. Whether or not they were pious, like as people, good character, all of that. They evaluated all of this before they came to the conclusion that this is a hadith that's valid. So it was a science of looking into the biographies, if you will, of those lives, and oftentimes this was orally transmitted, you knew who the people were. They, by the way, they also looked into, like, if this person says they learned the hadith from so-and-so, did they actually ever meet? When was their meeting? Right? Because you can say anything you want. But if you actually lived in a different time period or in a different place and there was no way of you meeting this person, that hadith would be thrown out and say that's not appropriate. That's what a hadith consists of. So I just wanted you to know there's a whole science that's developed here. It's a classification system of what's mutawatir, what's sahih, what's ahad. I'm not going to go into that. Again, there's a hadith class that we'll learn later. But this is all being developed in that early period of Islam. There were also in the Tawheed sciences, there were issues. This is a big slide, so I'll just cover it, a lot of words I should say. There were doctrinal issues. Issues of Aqidah. For instance, you had somebody who said, I'm a prophet after the Prophet, actually even during his lifetime. Muslims had to weed that out and say, no, that is not an acceptable position. Yes, brother. There's no audio on YouTube? I mean, I'm on the microphone, so I don't know how to fix that issue. So unless there's something with the microphone here. Where is it? Oh, that's the camera? Okay. I apologize to those who are watching online. They're just seeing me walk around. Oh, they are? Okay. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if this one's, I don't know what's linked to that particular camera. If you're online, come to class. We're here. No, just kidding. Okay, so as I was mentioning, maybe hopefully we can figure this out, inshallah. But this was Musaylama. I mentioned him last time. He declared himself to be prophet during the life of the Prophet ﷺ. Right? And the Prophet ﷺ said, when he wrote a letter back to him, he said, Musaylama al-Kadhab, you are a liar. That was actually the first doctrinal issue. Right? You guys know what I mean by doctrinal? Right? Like this was part of the doctrine of Islam. That was one of the first issues. Later on, there would be other issues that would come up. There are some people that attributed divinity later on to Imam Ali. There are issues that happen with on topics like apostasy. What should we do with people who have left Islam? There were people that argued about, whether or not the source of Allah was the source of evil versus good. There's all these different issues that came up. I only bring that up to you not to resolve them, but to say that the scholars had to deal with this as well. So along with Islamic law, they also had new ideas that were coming in that they had to then negotiate and say, this is not part of Islam and this is part of Islam, right? We are very fortunate today that all those issues have been worked out. Because now what we know as being the corpus of Islamic law and Islamic Aqidah is by and large already fully baked. There's other issues that come up. I know recently, for instance, somebody brought up with me, hey, you work in the IT field. What happens if at some point we get AI that's actually generally intelligent enough to, like you have general intelligence, what do we do with that? My answer to them was convert the robot, right? Make the robot Muslim. So maybe that'll help it. But these are issues, there's issues like this that are coming up, like, hey, how are we supposed to understand artificial intelligence? Yes, sister. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Very, very good question, sister. We addressed this a little bit last week as well. So the question was, and the question is, how are we supposed to understand the expansion of Islam when it came to militarily? Like, how was that justified, essentially, from an Islamic law standpoint? And how are we to understand that today? So going back to something I mentioned last week, in the pre-modern world, basically prior to World War II, maybe prior to 1900, let's just say, the default state of the world was war. You assumed that you were always going to be at war. How do I know that? Because you had to actually declare peace with your neighbors, whoever they were, via a treaty or something like that. So the Muslims understood that if we want to take the dawah out and we want to make sure that we are not crushed, we're living in a world either where we will be crushed or we have to go out and expand. And they understood this as this is the means for us to make sure we're defensively, attending to protecting our space and our religion and our practices. Now, that all changed in the last century because now the default world of the default state of the world is peace. You actually, as a country, have to declare war on another country. So that's a huge shift from an Islamic law standpoint. Had that norm been the case before, then we wouldn't have had all the conversion that you saw in the world happening over hundreds of years. It would have just happened naturally, right? But politically, in order for Muslim polity to survive, it had to do this expansion because that's the way that the world of the empires worked, right? So that's kind of, and the scholars understood this. Many of them didn't fight back on that because they understood this is the norm in the world today. In order for us to protect ourselves, we always have to be kind of protecting our borders. And those borders over time kept expanding. I hope that helps, inshallah. Again, I'm not going to get into all the issues that are in here just because there's a lot, and frankly, there's no need for it. But what I want everyone here to understand is that the Muslims had they had a lot of challenges even to their core belief system when they were, and they had to sift through that. And the scholars helped identify these are the right things to do and these are the not so right things to do and to believe. There is one group in particular that I just want to mention because they actually became the caliph, the Mu'tazila. The Mu'tazila were a group of what we would call super rationalists today that were interested in basically making reason, like everything in Islam had to have a rationalization and a reason. And this led them to certain beliefs that were problematic. And so what ended up happening, eventually the Khalifas themselves became Mu'tazila. And they actually conducted an inquisition, what we would call an inquisition, against Muslims that did not have their belief system. Okay? One of the core issues, I'll just share it here. They believe the Quran to have been created. Everything that is created has an end, right? Kullu man alayha fan, wa yabqa wajhu rabbika dhul jalali wal ikram. Everything has an end except for the countenance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, The reason I bring that up is this became a huge issue for them, to the point where the Khalifa would send out deputies to scholars and to other people to say, do you believe the Quran to be created? And if they did not answer the way that he wanted them to answer, they would be jailed or imprisoned. So this became it became like an inquisition against Muslim scholars. Now, just before anybody else asks, the normative position of Sunni Islam is that the Quran is uncreated. It is the eternal speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay? That's our general position. So let's clear that up before somebody says, Brother Shahad's promoting things that shouldn't, historically inaccurate. Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal in particular was tortured and jailed because he had that opinion. That no, the Quran is uncreated. It is not a created thing. I know it seems like a semantic issue, but this became a huge issue during this time. Right? So there were other schools of Aqidah, like the Asharis and the Maturidis and the Atharis that came up and developed in order to contrast what the Mu'tazila were saying. And there's like a lot of nuances here. We don't need to get into it. Know this. By and large, each of these schools of Aqidah agree on the vast majority of stuff. So we don't have a lot of difference of opinion when it comes to Muslims. I can go to Muslims in China, Muslims in Africa, Muslims in America, Muslims in Europe, and we all basically believe the same stuff. Nobody's going to argue and say, hey, there's actually 6 prayers, you missed one, right? They're not going to say that. These core beliefs are there. Nobody's going to say, hey, it was the wrong Prophet Muhammad. This is the one that was, nobody's going to say that. These are core belief systems that we all kind of agree and accept. Yes, Rain. Eventually they died out. So there was a series of debates that the Mu'tazila were in, and they kept losing these debates to the Sunni scholars, and eventually that whole super rationalist theology school just died out. The Asharis, the Maturidis, the other schools took precedence, and that's what people believe even to this day. That's a good question. Some people say that, hey, the Greek philosophers are really the ones that started this ultra-rationalist theories. Yes, that there is an element of that. But what I want to say is, people sometimes blame the Greeks like they imported something into our religion. One thing we have to understand is as Islam spread, there were Greeks that became Muslim. So they already came with a certain understanding of the world, and now they're Muslim, and they're trying to negotiate like, hey, this is my understanding of the world that I grew up with. This is what it means, right? And so there's a certain amount to which you just have to negotiate, kind of like, hey, this is acceptable and this is not. My teacher I don't have a whiteboard here, but he would draw up on the board and he'd write, she go to school, right? He would just write that, she go to school. All right, now, what he'd say is, my 3-year-old, you'd say, maybe 5-year-old. He's like, my 5-year-old just wrote this sentence. She go to school. Is that correct? Grammatically, is that correct? Why? What? Why do you know that? Yeah. In English, what should it say? What should it say, guys? She goes to school. Why do you know that? Because you know how the English language works, correct? Did she mean to write she go to school or she goes to school? She's 5. No, I'm being serious. She's 5, right? To her, she might have meant to write, she go to school. She believes very firmly. If a 15-year-old wrote that, you're like, well, actually, he or she did it wrong on purpose, right? Why do I bring that up? Because that 5-year-old or that 15, they may believe very wholeheartedly in that. And you and I know that, hey, all that's missing is that E and the S at the end. It should be she goes to school. But we understand the ethos of what's meant there. That's what these rationalists were doing. They understood already how the world worked. And they're saying, hey, with Islam, this is how I can reconcile the world and our understanding of Islam. Muslims had to come later and say, yes, some of that is okay, but some of it is outside the fold of Islam. That's what they had to negotiate, right? And people are going to be like, is Islam a 5-year-old or a 15-year-old, right? Based on this example. Now, again, she may believe very hard, that 5-year-old girl may believe very wholeheartedly in it, But an adult would come and say, there's something missing here. That's what they would argue, right? It's a bad example, sorry. But all right, let's go on real quick here, inshallah ta'ala. Development of fiqh and sharia. Imam Abu Hanifa was one of the first scholars to hint towards something known as maqasid al-sharia. What is the objective of the sharia? The objectives of the sharia. So they understood that if sharia is meant to be Allah's law, and we've been developing all of these hadith sciences, how is it that we can understand the objectives of what Allah wants? Right? We're coming up on time. All right. So this was the first scholar. He was the first scholar to hint towards maqasid al-sharia. Imam Malik, distinct from Imam Abu Hanifa, who died in 150. Imam Malik dies 29 years later. He lived and studied his entire life in Medina. He did not leave. Imam Abu Hanifa traveled. Imam Shafi later traveled. Imam Malik did not. Imam Shafi was the first to systematize the formulation of Islamic law through his book Ar-Risala. And then Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, he emphasized the text of the hadith in promoting the sunnah, oftentimes as a reaction to the Mu'tazila, because again, he lived at the same time as the Mu'tazila, right? These four individuals, unknown at the time to them, would end up spawning the greatest schools of Islamic law that we still have to this day. The Hanafi school, the Maliki school, the Shafi'i school, and the Hanbali school. Now, those aren't the only ones. In fact, by the 4th century, there was actually a 5th school called the Zahiri school, which was established and was very, very active. We know what we know of the Zahiri school, not just because it's referenced in a bunch of early texts, but also because one of its most famous scholars is a man by the name of Ibn Hazm. And Ibn Hazm's works are translated and still read today. Long story short, the Zahiri school was a very literalist interpretation of the text. So if it said, do this, they would do it exactly as the text said. Most of the other scholars did not understand that, did not follow that all the way through, right? There are some things that are meant to be literal, some things that are not. For instance, I'll give you guys an example. In the Zahiri school, there's a hadith about the 6 things that constitute riba, or not constitute, but in which you can have riba, essentially usury. It's gold for gold, silver for silver, wheat for wheat, barley for barley, grain for grain, something. There's one other one. He actually argued, Ibn Hazm, that interest can only be on those 6 things. That's it. So paper money doesn't count, the way we have it today, right? So it's just an understanding of like how it was. Now, of course, other scholars disagreed with him on that, say, no, those were just used as examples of money, and so therefore, even with paper money, you're going to have to be wary of interest and things like that. Right, so that's just one kind of example. There's a bunch of other ones. But the point is, there were 5 schools at one point. Eventually, it came down to 4 because the Zahiri school just wasn't able to reproduce the scholars the way that the other schools did. Okay? And this was, again, to note this here, this is the product of the Muslim community. This is what's happening on the ground, regardless of what political issues are happening at the state. And by the way, when we get into it, you'll see all the political issues that are happening in the state. But the Muslims are producing this. There's a huge amount of intellect here that's going into these things. Over time, the rulers would come to accept whatever these Islamic law schools were as being definitive, that we have to abide by what they say because they have authority over people. That's what people are following. The madhabs in particular have outlasted every other institution in Islam. Many of us, follow madhabs or have teachers that have followed madhabs because there's a direct linkage between what they teach today and what was looks like this one's back. Yeah, you can keep it over there. If it goes out again, we'll look at it. Okay, so real quick, inshallah, I think I have 2 slides left. Yes. Maqasid, Islamic law is concerned with 5 major objectives. They identified this very early on. Everybody here should know this. what are the 5 things? It is there to preserve religion, deen. Every action in Sharia is meant to preserve our deen. Preservation of nufus or nafs, life. Preservation of nasab, progeny, like inheritance, if you will, right? Making sure that lineage. Preservation of aql, intellect, and preservation of mal, property. The objectives of the Sharia is to preserve these 5 things. This is by and large agreed upon by the scholars. Some have actually made it more than just these 5, but nearly all of the earliest scholars agree that these 5 things, if there's a ruling that needs to be adjusted, it's because one of these 5 things is threatened. For instance, if in order to preserve life, if the only thing you have available to drink is alcohol, it is permissible for you to drink alcohol to preserve your life. Same thing for eating pork, for instance, right? If that's all that's left, that is permissible. In normative circumstances, that is not permissible, right? But in order for preservation of that, there's some dispensation that's given. These 5 things, by and large, are what Sharia is concerned with preserving. And this is, again, developed by scholars later on. If any of these are threatened, then the community at large must create rules to protect them and the scholars, according to the Islamic scholars. So there has to be somebody that must protect them. That's why it's very important, brothers and sisters, that in every community you have a group of students who are interested in preserving deen, right? Making sure that the practice and knowledge of the religion is preserved. That's actually a communal obligation to have that. And this was also focused on the general readings of the global understanding of Islam, not just individual rules, right? So there are many scholars that looked at like the whole corpus of hadith and corpus of Sharia and said these are what it's meant to protect. There are scholars that were very active in this field. Imam Abu Hanifa, I mentioned earlier, he was one of the first to hint at maqasid al-Sharia. But Imam al-Shatibi probably wrote the most comprehensive book about it. It's still quoted to this day. Scholars like Al-Ghazali, Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn al-Qayyim, they all make reference to the maqasid. And Ibn Ashur in the last century also expanded on the idea of maqasid al-Sharia. We also have modern day scholars like Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya and others that especially when discussing Islam in the West and how it changes, they look at how do we understand the objectives of the Sharia for people to practice Islam in the West? Okay, I want to give everybody a break because I'm getting tired and I'm sure you all are too, and it's been an hour. Any questions before we go to break? Yes. Got it. Anything else? Why don't we take a 10-minute break, get up, stretch, do all of that, inshallah, and then when we come back, we will begin with the early Umayyads. The Umayyads, and share some stories about that early Umayyad period, that 90-year period, inshallah ta'ala. if we can start getting back into the musalla, inshallah, then we'll go ahead and get started in just about a minute here. Okay. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله. All right, let's go ahead and get started, inshallah ta'ala, with Muawiyah and the Umayyads. Couple of points to note here. Normally when I do this course, I think I mentioned this before, but I will start with the Umayyads here, where the region of the world that we'll be talking about. However, their history is very interesting because they end up crossing the entire North African continent and then establishing an Umayyad dynasty in Spain. And so usually I do that all in one class. There's just way too much to cover. So what we'll probably do, I'm going to try to get through the Umayyads in the Arabian Peninsula today, and then we'll start next time with the Umayyads in Spain and how they get established there. And then we'll cover all of kind of that region of the world, the Spanish history, all the way up until about the 1500s. Okay? Does that sound like a plan? So what we will be talking about today is kind of the Umayyads in the heartland of Islam, if you will. I'm not going to get into, well, there's a lot of details here that I'm going to leave out, just because there's a lot. It's a 90-year history for the Umayyads, and I want to kind of hit the best hits, if you will, from that time period. So the first name that everyone should know is the name of Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan. He is probably one of the most effective governors that even under the time of Uthman that there was in terms of administering Damascus and Syria and that portion of the world, which had at that point come under Muslim rule. If you guys recall from the last class, Muawiyah and Ali had a difference of opinion about what should happen to the killers of Uthman. Ali believed in asserting that we need to establish unity as a khilafah first, and Muawiyah believed, because he was a relative of Uthman, that they needed to take care of the killers of Uthman. Eventually there was a truce that was made, and Ali was recognized as the Khalifa. When Ali radiallahu anhu is killed, there is then at that point an understanding that, Muawiyah perhaps is the next most able ruler. But there were a group of people that actually nominated Hassan for Khalifa. Hassan, the son of Ali, for Khalifa. Muawiyah did not want to plunge the kind of Muslim world into another civil war. So essentially he ends up negotiating with Hassan ibn Ali ibn Abi Talib to abandon the claim to Khalifa, and instead Hassan ends up being he lives a life of worship and piety in Mecca for the rest of his days. Muawiyah in particular rules from the Damascus area in Syria. And he revived Omar's system of segregating kind of the Arab Muslims from the conquered populations. You guys remember this last week? We talked about how Muslims in different areas that they went, they would establish garrison towns. right? Those like little army outposts. He wanted to make sure that those were established everywhere Muslims ruled. Now, oftentimes that meant that Muslims did not have a lot of interaction with the locals. They did at a limited level, but it also meant that the locals could keep their customs. They could keep their religion, they could keep their laws, there wasn't a lot of interference. They just had to recognize that the ruler was the Muslim at that point, right? That was what was good. So he was very keen on this to make sure that that was the case, that as Muslims went out, that's what was established. He was the governor of Syria, and eventually, although he did rely on non-Muslim officials from the former Byzantine and Persian empires to build up his state government. Right now, again, we talked about Islam spreading in time and space. They're coming into new lands. These lands do not speak Arabic. Official records are not kept in Arabic. They are largely Roman or Greek or Persian. And so he elects governors from those areas that converted. They were Muslim, but they were from those areas and they understood those people. Slowly, however, Arabs would start to begin filling up the top positions. So this, it's interesting. I think Dr. Was it Montgomery Watt? One of the early Orientalists, or even actually Karen Armstrong, she mentions this actually in her book. As Islam spreads here, it's still very much seen as an Arab phenomenon, because the people who are in power are still Arabs. At this point in Islamic history, it's the Arabs that are ruling these areas. Even later on when we get to Umayyad Spain, right? In Spain, they're still seen as the Arabs, even though they're like hundreds of years in Spain at that point, right? But they're still seen as like the Arab conquerors. So he was very keen on that. And there's a number of different things that he does in order to, basically de-emphasize political divisions within his own community. He decides to expand out. Again, he's a very shrewd statesman. So during his time, there's a couple of battles that everybody should know about. Number one, he sent an army to Constantinople. Where's Constantinople? Istanbul, which is where? Turkey, yes. So you're basically going into the heartland of Europe at this point, or at least the edge of Europe and Asia. Constantinople is known as the impregnable city. It has walls upon walls that are built around it. Muawiyah had amassed enough influence and enough of an army to actually go and try and take Constantinople in 674. Now, he does not succeed. He does not succeed in taking Constantinople. In fact, it's another 800 years, actually, before Constantinople would fall to the Muslims. But he lacked the technology to take over, but there are still some very, very important Sahaba that were out on that mission with him, one of whom is still visited to this day, Abu Ayyub al-Ansari. Anybody know in the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ what Abu Ayyub is known for? What's that? Say that again? That's right. When the Prophet's mosque was being built, it's in the home of Abu Ayyub al-Ansari that the Prophet stayed. So for months, he was doing khidmah of the Prophet ﷺ while the masjid was being built and the home was being built in Medina. And subhanAllah, I always think about that. Because today, there are millions upon millions of Muslims every month that go to Istanbul to give salam to Abu Ayyub al-Ansari in his resting place. The khidmah of the Prophet led to millions of people coming to visit him. Subhanallah. Right? Just when you think about it from that perspective. But he is one of those. He was in the army of Muawiyah that went out to Constantinople. He ends up dying in that, right outside those walls, and which is why he was buried there. Eventually, however, now, of course, if you've been to the Ansari district in Istanbul, you know it's all within kind of the precinct of Istanbul. Fun fact, by the way, the Ottoman Caliph, before in his coronation, when he would become Caliph, would actually go to Abu Ayyub al-Ansari's masjid to pray 2 rakahs, gain blessing from there before going into the palace in Topkapi to do the official coronation. That's how important it was. And there's a whole history there. Maybe Brother Salahuddin can share it with us, inshallah. But there's a whole history there about what, how Muhammad al-Fatih and everybody found this grave. It's a beautiful story. Anyways, In 670, so that was 674, so he's got an army going towards Constantinople. In 670, Uqba ibn Nafi radiallahu anhu, a companion of the Prophet ﷺ, began to sweep across North Africa. So you start to see this line of conquering that happens North Africa, gets all the way to the shores of Morocco in the early 680s. So he takes over Kairouan in Tunis, in Tunisia. By the way, what's really amazing, Hugh Kennedy has a book called The Great Arab Conquest, and he talks about how Byzantine rule was so corrupt at this point that when the Muslims came, people were willingly giving the keys of their city over to the Muslims. So there wasn't a lot of battles that were fought. There were some, but by and large, the non-Muslims were like, look, you guys, what we have heard is you are way more just than the Byzantines. Here's our city. And Hugh Kennedy makes an interesting point. He says the only reason we even know, there's no like battle scars or remains that remain. The only reason we still know that the Arabs took over that land is because those areas speak Arabic today. That's how you know. Otherwise, there's not a lot of historical, oh, this battle was fought and this was it. North Africa, by and large, was opened up because of the justice of that Islam brought, that Muslims were bringing to those lands. Just think about that for a moment. Right? It's really kind of powerful. The Umayyad rule did bring cohesion to a newly expanded territories, but something was happening inside, which was the court life of the Umayyads became very lavish. At this point, many historians begin to say that the caliphate now becomes a kingship. And from this point forward, what we'll see is that by and large, the caliph becomes something that's inherited by birth or by birthright, right? That is not the case with the previous khalifas that we saw. They were all either chosen or appointed by the Muslims at this time. It starts to take on this like monarchy type of lifestyle, and this is at odds with traditional Arab custom. To be clear, this is not a very Arab thing. And especially not with the egalitarian message of the Quran, right? But it is very much a part of Islamic life in terms of the dictator, or in terms of the royalty that would come out. There's a lot of, one thing it did prevent, well, it pushed off. I shouldn't say it prevented, it pushed off. The line of succession, all of the fitna that happens, trying to determine who the next ruler is going to be, right? That largely gets consolidated into one family. Now the family is going to decide, or the current ruler is going to decide who the next ruler is going to be. And they have the army on their side, they have the wealth on their side, they have all these things on their side. So you don't have a lot of like infight. And it does happen, and that's why the Abbasids take over later. But for about 100 years, 90 years or so, at least in the time of the Umayyads, it stabilizes that economy and the succession planning. So, and just to make that, again, there's a lot of bloodshed and stuff that can happen in revolution. We've seen that. We saw that in America, right? The Revolutionary War was a very bloody war. That led even to the Civil War, which is the bloodiest war, right? So there were a lot of bloody wars that were fought just for succession, for kind of the soul of a country. That gets essentially consolidated just into the Umayyad, into the family of Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan. Okay? He also has, as I mentioned here, he's not just got a well-trained army of Syrian soldiers, but actually the first navy is established from Damascus, and it goes out towards Cyprus and towards Greece. Yes, Anurabai.
Sorry, I don't want to be late. What you were saying here, there was stability, but the way they got the stability was moving away from selecting the next Khalifa with a large number of people to basically a monarchy.
Yes.
So Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam didn't do a monarchy. None of the Khalifa Rashidun did. So this was moving, and they were selected in different ways.
Yes. Yeah.
This was revolutionary.
This was correct.
Revolutionary at the time, asking people what they thought, different clan leaders, different people, and each one was elected slightly differently. But then we moved to monarchy.
Yeah. We moved to monarchy, and it's a forced move. It's not like the people accepted it, per se, right? But they justified it in their own way, saying this is what we need.
And it was with the army by sword.
By sword.
By sword, by force. They did something that the previous Khalifa and Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam did not do.
Did not do, correct. Yeah, they established, dynastic rule was established at this point. That's why I mentioned before, you had a religious authority and a political authority that was unified. At this point, that no longer happens. Now you have a religious authority in the scholars that we were talking about earlier in the first half of class, and you have political authority in the monarchs, essentially, right? The kingship and the monarchs. The caliphate becomes very much kind of a seat of, it's like the seat of the royal family from this point forward. There are exceptions. We'll talk about one of the exceptions in a moment, right? But there are exceptions to that, but by and large, this is where it's going. Now, historians will argue back and forth whether or not this is a good thing or a bad thing, whether or not it was, you can look back and say, hey, yes, maybe it led to some stability, but it also caused a whole bunch of other problems. I think personally all it did was just push off the inevitable, because at some point you do have a revolution that does overthrow the Umayyads, because they're no longer treating people equally. They have a strong preference for the Arabs. They have a strong preference for the Quraysh. They have a strong preference to the point everybody else starts to feel like second-class or third-class citizens. Anytime that happens, remember we talked about it in the previous class, what did Ibn Khaldun say? Anytime the people begin to feel this type of inequality, they will revolutionize. They will throw a revolution to overthrow the government. That's just natural. You can't beat people into submission forever. At some point, people will rise up. So this is during the time of Muawiyah. Now, again, he was a great statesman, did great things, but as I mentioned here, domination of Islam was still very much an Arab phenomenon at this point. It changes with the Abbasids, which we'll discuss later on. Yazid ibn Muawiyah. Now, this is probably at this point, Yazid is the son of Muawiyah. He is appointed as the next Khalifa. I haven't read a historian yet that thought in any way, shape, or form he was qualified to be a caliph. He is not looked very favorably upon, even in Sunni history. Okay? So to be clear, Muawiyah probably made that choice thinking, hey, I'm going to try and keep this, keep revolution from happening and just securely make sure that my son is the one who's he knows how everything works, and so therefore I'm going to give him control. But history does not look favorably upon Yazid for a number of reasons. So again, he wanted to bypass the wars of succession, but this led to the ascension of Yazid, and Yazid had rebellions throughout his entire rule. There were people that were uprising against him, right? Unlike his father and the rightly guided Khalifas before him, Yazid was not known for his piety whatsoever, right? And so people, he wasn't a favored pick amongst the people. Now, what ends up happening? There's a lot of, I'm going to leave out a lot of details because you could do a whole class or a series of classes on his time here. But there is something known as the second fitna. The second fitna, right? The first fitna was during the time of Ali ibn Abi Talib. The second fitna, you have in Kufa people who are Ali leaning. These are people that consider themselves the followers of Ali, that believe there should have been an egalitarian way by which the next Khalifa should have been chosen. And they wanted Hussein. They wanted Imam Hussein, who is the son of Imam Ali, to be the Khalifa. I believe Imam Hassan at this point had already died. Right? So they're like, okay, Hussein should be the rightful leader and Khalifa for the Muslims. Now, unfortunately, there's a whole story behind what happens here. Imam Hussein believed he had a certain number of followers in Kufa, was going to Kufa. Yazid essentially takes an army and starves out Hussein and his entire family and entourage. That incident is known to, and we know it today as, that happened at Karbala. Karbala, which is in Iraq, right? Outside of Kufa. And that is what is commemorated by many Muslims even to this day, especially Shia Muslims, right? So this is a big kind of, it's huge in the historical memory of Muslims, this event. And again, Yazid is thrown as he's seen as the kind of the bad guy, if you will, in this part of the thing. Because he wasn't known for his piety, he was fighting Imam Hussein, who many people felt should have been the rightful heir. By the way, he's not the only one. There were also people who put Abdullah ibn Zubayr in Medina and declared him Khalifa. And said, he should be the Khalifa, not Yazid. Yes, Reem? Both. Okay. So I don't actually know the specifics around it, but yeah, nobody considers him to have been, like his family was starved. I believe he was too. I don't remember if there was actually what the actual final numbers were. Okay, so so again, he's on the point of just Karbala. People see this as a murder of Imam Hussein and his family. And there are now people who call themselves Shi'at Ali, which is the party of Ali, and the noble prophet, or the family of the Prophet ﷺ. This becomes a symbol of chronic injustice that they must fight. So even in Shia history today, it's still very much seen as that. In fact, there's a lot of Sunnis actually who feel this too, that this is Imam Hussein standing for justice against injustice, the injustice of Yazid and Hajjaj ibn Yusuf. Now, after that massacre, there's also, he has to deal with Abdullah ibn Zubayr, who, not in Medina, in Mecca, he wanted to rule, right, from Mecca. He ends up ruling, I think, for like 7 or 8 years. He's actually like the bona fide kind of Khalifa in that area. But in 683, the Umayyad troops, they take Medina, they lift their siege of Mecca. In that scuffle, Yazid and his young son Muawiyah are both killed. Abdullah ibn Zubayr is nominated to be the next Khalifa in Medina, but he's isolated in the Hijaz, and there's an uprising in 684. At the end of the day, eventually what ends up happening is Marwan ibn Abdul Malik, right? Marwan ibn Abdul Malik? Marwan ibn al-Hakam, sorry. Marwan ibn al-Hakam ends up defeating all of the other rivals. He is from the lineage of Muawiyah, and he ends up defeating all the other rivals, including Abdullah ibn Zubayr, and becomes the unified Khalifa at this point. So again, early on in Islamic history, I know people sometimes are hard to grasp, but guys, Islam is meant for every people in every time and in every generation. I want to be very clear with that. Why do I say that? If people oftentimes say like, oh man, within 60 years or 100 years or 200 years, Islam had fallen into all of these different like infighting. Yes, Islam dumb, because people don't change. People are still egotistical. People are still after money and wealth and resources. And if it were the case that that wasn't the case, then there'd be no need for Islam today. But in every generation, you have to eradicate whatever the norm is of that time. At the time of the Prophet ﷺ, he was fighting against idolatry. Just because idolatry in Mecca is gone does not mean that Islam is irrelevant now. You still have to fight against the guiles of shaitan in other ways. So I'm just saying that to say rulers are not exempt from this. Some would argue rulers need more Islam than everybody else. It's important for us to, when we're looking at history, we recognize these are human beings with very human problems. And in some cases, like who we'll come to next, you have really incredible human beings. And in some cases, not so much. Right? So at this point, outside of the first 4 Khalifas, right, those were incredible human beings that were incredible political entities in and of themselves. But at this point, now you're dealing with Khalifas on one side and basically pious Muslims and others. Maybe they interconnect at certain people in certain points, but otherwise they don't. So just keep that in mind. Marwan ibn al-Hakam eventually ascends to the throne. He disposes of his allies. He kills Abdullah ibn Zubayr himself. So this is what we've gotten to at this point. Abdullah ibn Zubayr, by the way, famous Sahabi, just so everybody knows, was the first child born in Medina after the Prophet ﷺ came to Medina. The hadith that we have about chewing some date and then taking the pieces of the date and putting it on the gums of the child that's being referred to there is Abdullah ibn Zubayr. The Prophet ﷺ did that to him. And he was, by the way, there's many stories about him. We could do a whole class on Abdullah ibn Zubayr, but he was very well qualified to be the Khalifa. Obviously, he didn't last that long. One of the things to mention is the next one, actually, so it'll be after him, but Abdul Malik ibn Marwan. So here, Abdul Malik he unifies under his rule, so this is Marwan's son, basically. Marwan himself, I think, only ruled 2 years, maybe 1 year or 2 years. And then Abdul Malik ibn Marwan takes over. He unified most of the lands of Islam, North Africa and Central Asia. All of that came under kind of his governorship or his rulership. It includes Berbers and Turks as Muslims alongside Arabs. So at this point, although the hukuma, the ruling party is Arab, many of the people around are not. The Muslims and the non-Muslims, they're from different parts of the world. It's not until this point that Arabic becomes the official language of the caliphate. Why? Why did it take so long? This is, again, 60 years into the Khilafah. No, more than that, actually. 685, yeah, 613, yeah, 70 years into the Khilafah. Why did it take so long? What's that? Where? They didn't. No, that's the issue. See, so brother brings up a good point. The problem was Arabs spoke Arabic, but many of the people that were being ruled did not. They were Byzantine, correct? At least in Damascus and Syria, they were Byzantine. In Iran, they were Persian. So they were keeping their official records of their properties and their marriages and their vows all in different languages, or languages that were not Arabic. So if Ali or somebody had mandated that the language of the caliphate is going to be Arabic at that time, we would have lost a whole bunch of records. And people would have been like, I don't even know Arabic. I have no idea who owns that property, who doesn't, where is that? None of that would have made any sense. At this point, it becomes relevant enough. Enough Arabs are in enough places and enough people that know Arabic that now we can make the official language of all of our documentation moving forward is going to be Arabic. The reason I bring this up, guys, is because people just assume that we went into these lands and they all of a sudden, everybody was a Hufaz and everybody was speaking Arabic and everybody knew Hadith. That's not the case at all. Not during these first 100 years. All of this is still being formulated. Even the Caliphate itself could not keep official records in Arabic until the time of Abdul Malik ibn Marwan. Okay? So just keep that in mind, inshallah. So Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, all documentation prior to this, as I mentioned, was in Persian or Greek. Political Islam spread quicker than devotional Islam. And I mentioned already Dick Bullett's book. It would take about 200 years for lands to become majority Muslim. By the way, by majority Muslim, I mean 51% Muslim. So we're not even talking about a super majority, right, where it's like 90% Muslim. Communication systems ended up connecting much of the Muslim world. This is really remarkable. The Caliphate itself, or the governors, were able to even communicate with each other via pigeons, right? Honing pigeons. They start putting this together now. And probably one of the most famous symbols from the time of Abdul Malik ibn Marwan is the Dome of the Rock, which is still extant today in Jerusalem, inside the complex of Masjid Omar, or Masjid al-Aqsa, I should say. This was completed in 691. 691 is where the Dome of the Rock is completed. Right? And by the way, this is the official, just so everybody knows, this is the official Dome of the Rock, in that everybody thinks this is Masjid al-Aqsa. This is not Masjid al-Aqsa. This is the Dome of the Rock. Right? In fact, I think on the next slide, I have yes. Yeah, here we go. So this is the complex. I know it's a little hard to see on here. Inshallah, I'll share these slides now that the WhatsApp groups have started. But that's the complex right there that you see. So the Dome of the Rock is kind of at the center of the complex. But this whole thing is known as Masjid al-Aqsa, and that's Masjid Omar right there in the front. This is the Qibli Masjid right there. That's where Omar was said to have prayed. Omar ibn Khattab, when Jerusalem was first opened. And these are actually pictures from the dome itself. I had a chance about in 2014 when I visited Jerusalem, I actually did Jummah prayer inside the Dome of the Rock, which was very interesting because it's not the same complex as the Greater Aqsa and Masjid, but there's actually an imam that gave a khutbah for Masjid Omar, and then we had our own khutbah here inside the Dome of the Rock, which I was like, why wouldn't they just connect it? But I think traditionally they've always had separate imams. So, okay. Al-Walid ibn Abdul Malik was the next ruler, and he begins the expansion into the Iberian Peninsula. Anybody know where the Iberian Peninsula is? Spain, yes. So now we're starting to move past, we've moved across North Africa and now getting up into Europe. In particular, there's a very famous general by the name of Tariq ibn Ziyad, who in 711 crosses the Strait of Jabal Tariq, Strait of Gibraltar, and he lands on a mountain known as Jabal Tariq, Gibraltar, named after him, and he pushes forward into the Spanish territories that were under Christian kings at that point. So from 711 to 715, Tariq and Musa, who was Musa ibn Nusayr, both of them managed to bring the entirety of the Iberian Peninsula under Muslim control, under Umayyad control. So within a short period of time. Again, guys, much of this was because the Christian rulers at that time, it's not like they were really great moral people and everybody wanted to be like that. There was a lot of corruption in that land. And what the Muslims were able to do was take advantage of that corruption and that dissension from the people there. Musa ibn Nusayr, by the way, was the Umayyad governor of Maghrib, of the Moroccan area, that sent Tariq ibn Ziyad to go there. And they were fighting Roderick. I was looking at the name of the king, it was Roderick. Now, also during this time, the early 700s, do I have it on here? Yeah, the expansion to Sindh. So into India. So you have on one side going far, far west. On the other side, you have expansion into India under a very famous general by the name of Muhammad bin Qasim. Muhammad bin Qasim is credited oftentimes as opening up the entire Indian subcontinent for Islam and for the Muslims, right? There's an interesting story here, I'll just kind of read it. It says there was a Raja Dahir who refused to return captive merchant sailors that were taken by pirates in Sri Lanka. And so the Muslim army marched across the subcontinent with very little resistance and with Buddhist temple officials. They were Buddhist. They met and ended up defeating Zahir's army near the Indus River in 712, and they killed him in battle. Muhammad bin Qasim brought Sindh under Islamic rule, and he extended religious freedom to both the Hindus and the Buddhists at that time. Again, Muslims were interested in making sure that the general populace still had the ability to abide by their customs and their religious rule, whatever that might be. Dawah, I think I was telling somebody earlier today, Dawah was not seen as a state affair. It was seen as an individual one. So people would individually give dawahs, but you didn't necessarily have a committee, like a state committee of dawah, going out there and just preaching. That would happen later, but at this point it doesn't. So the Islamic Empire, now we're talking about 100 years after the Prophet ﷺ's initial wahi. At this point, it's going all the way from Spain to India, but only about 10% of the people that it rules over are Muslim. So 90% of the people there that you're ruling over that whole vast area of land are non-Muslim. But again, the hukuma, the actual ruling class, if you will, is Muslim. It's interesting, I have in my notes here. Non-Muslims would be tempted to convert in order to avoid paying the jizya tax. That was actually one of the reasons that they would look into converting. But government revenues would collapse if a policy was established that converts still had to pay jizya. This is under the Umayyads, right? If you were a convert, if you were originally a Muslim, OG Muslim, you're okay. But if you're a convert Muslim, you still got to pay jizya. What did they do? They were effectively institutionalizing racism. Let's be real. That's what it was. It was institutionalized, systematic racism, and only non-Arabs would make up the converts. Obviously, you couldn't argue that an Arab converted. They'd already converted 100 years before, right? This would, needless to say, this would sow a lot of dissension within people. Now, I want to cover one last really important ruler from this time period. This is Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. Many, many, many Muslim scholars consider Umar ibn Abdul Aziz the fifth of the rightly guided caliphs. So there are four, and they consider him the fifth. Okay? Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, his mother was the granddaughter of Umar ibn Khattab. His mother is the granddaughter of Umar ibn Khattab. He came and he ruled only for about 2.5 years. Again, very similar to Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. But what he did in this period was incredible. And he was born and raised kind of in Medina. He refused to live in the palace in Damascus. But even when he became Khalifa, he's like, nope, I'm staying right here in Medina. And a lot of his reforms included equalizing things between Arabs and non-Arabs. For him, a Muslim was a Muslim, right? He standardized weights and measures. He reduced corruption in the government. He prohibited the sale of certain types of land, which was considered public property. They essentially eradicated poverty during his time. There were governors that were sent out to collect zakah, to distribute the zakah in certain areas, and they came back with the full amount. And Umar ibn Abdul Aziz asked him what happened. He said, we couldn't find poor people to give the zakat to. That's how wealthy the time was during, and that's how not just wealth, how well run the administration was during his time. That poverty was nearly eradicated from the lands that he was controlling. Omar would send letters and edicts advising people on religious and moral reforms. His reforms included some of the following: strict abolishment of drinking alcohol. Again, there were lots of converts here that did a lot of stuff, and he was like, nope, no more alcohol. He forbid public nudity. He eliminated the use of mixed bathrooms for men and women, which apparently was a thing, and a fair dispensation of zakah, right? So getting rid of all of eradicating a lot of the poverty during his time. He also ordered the collection of hadith through scholars like Az-Zuhri and Ibn Hazm, because he was concerned that some of the hadith might be lost. So again, you can already tell he's operating at a different level than some of the scholars, some of the caliphs that we spoke about before him. He established an independent judiciary that made rulings based on Islamic teaching and not on the personal identity of the judge or whoever it was that was. What I mean by if a governor came, he would have to have the same ruling regardless of if he was governor of that town or if he was a lay person. Prisoners were given a stipend to educate themselves. Think about that for a moment. They were given a stipend to educate themselves because Islam in general, guys, is interested in changing people. It's not about punishment and just sending people to jail and just punishing them. No, he wanted them to make sure that they had some rectification. The rule of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz did not last for more than 2 years. I think it was actually identical to 2 years, 5 months, and 4 days. Lots of people say he was likely poisoned by one of his servants who had been, who may have been against the Umayyads at that time. But never took, again, some other points here that he never took from the caliphate treasury, and he died with only 17 dinars to his name. You're talking about palaces that were being built under the Umayyads, and he's like, no, I don't want to do with any of that. So eventually he is poisoned, and then you have towards the end Hisham ibn Abdul Malik. At this point, his empire stretched 4,500 miles over 3 continents, from southern France in the west to the borders of China in the east. He replaced Yazid II, who reversed many of the reforms of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. At this point, there's a lot of discontent and disunity in the Ummah. Muhammad ibn Ali, the great-grandson of Abbas, eventually overthrows the government of Hisham. And in 750, the Abbasids defeat the Umayyad army in Mosul, and they kill every last member of the Umayyad family. One person escapes, Abdurrahman, and he escapes from Syria, and the legend goes that he crossed on foot with him and a servant all the way across the North African continent, and then we will see his name again, inshallah ta'ala, next week, or next time, when we talk about the Umayyads in Spain. And so virtually 90 years after the Muawiyah ibn Abu Sufyan, you have the defeat and the overthrow of the monarchy or the dynasty of the Umayyads being replaced now by the Abbasids. We'll go ahead and take, we'll get into Spain and stuff next time. This is a good kind of natural stopping point, plus I've been talking for a while. So inshallah ta'ala, we'll end here. Just know that next time we'll begin with what happens to Abdul Rahman after this point. Right? Now that they've been deposed and thrown out from Damascus and from Syria, what happens next? Any questions about any of the, I realize I went very speedy through this. There's a lot of details here that I left out, right? But I wanted you to have a sense of who kind of the main players were during this time. Any questions or comments? I think it was his grandson. I have to check where the lineage is. Because he replaces Yazid II. So I don't remember if Yazid II was a son or if it was somebody else. I mean, whoever's got Wikipedia can probably look it up. I don't remember who the exact, where the lineage is there. Other questions or comments? Umayyads? The Abbasids were not happy, right? They end up overthrowing him. You're talking about in Islamic history? Okay, good question. So how do we as Muslims see the Umayyads? It's a very good question, actually. Look, I think you have to separate, you have to at some level look at what they did well and what they didn't, right? I don't think anybody would argue that they were the height of piety, maybe with the exception of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. But as a governorship and from a statesman perspective, they did do a lot over a vast empire, right? So they were able to effectively administer different parts of the empire, and they set up a lot of reforms. A lot of what we hear about in terms of the canal systems, in terms of the army, and like civilizationally, the things that maybe we'll spend a little bit of time talking about some of their accomplishments during that time. But this is also no small feat, right? Like what they designed with the Dome of the Rock, I mean, that's still seen as kind of an architectural phenomenon today, right? So there are certain things that they did that were very, that we would look very laudably on them for. But there was a lot of infighting, there was a lot of politicking, all of that we'll see in later generations as well. As administrators, generally what I have read, as administrators, they were seen as very effective. Yes? Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Right. They were all scholars. Yep. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a big argument to be said that they were not just scholars, they were working in the interest of the Ummah. Right? So they were scholars that were not concerned with their own egos, with amassing their own wealth, with their own extravagant lifestyles. They had no concern for any of that. They were interested in protecting Islam, essentially. That's what they were interested in protecting that ummah. And that was their ethos, if you will, in terms of everything that they did. Even the truces that they negotiated, even amongst each other, it was to protect the unity of the ummah. At this point, you don't have that. You have people that are frankly in it for themselves, or at least for their family, and not for anybody else, right? There's no, Umar ibn Abdul Aziz understood that. He's like, why are Arab converts being treated differently than non-Arab converts? Like, this is not, we were all converts at some point, right? So he understood that, but many of the other rulers did not until later. Any other questions? Final question? Okay, Jazakumullah khair, and I appreciate everybody hanging around for 2 hours to go through this. We'll begin with the Umayyads of Spain, which I think is going to be a fascinating class, inshallah. But as I mentioned, I'm not here next week. So in 2 weeks, I will send you or before 2 weeks, hopefully, I will send you a Zoom link, and we will do this class over Zoom. I will be on the West Coast at that point, but inshallah ta'ala we'll still be able to have our class. And if you have not signed up for the WhatsApp group, come to me right now and we can do it because I got onto it. Yes, sister, you had a question in the back. Yeah, there you go, inshallah. So, okay. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت واستغفرك وأتوب إليك بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. جزاكم الله خيرا everybody, appreciate you. Assalamu alaikum.